Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Demystifying the Forest Service Permit Process. My name is Severia and I'm the Communications Manager for Transforming Youth Outdoors, also known as TYO. TYO was created to scale the impact of outdoor youth development and transform the lives of youth by providing best practices, tools, and supports to individuals and organizations working to connect people to the outdoors. We are a technology platform that enables those in the field of outdoor recreation to learn, share, network, and build upon successes. Membership to TYO is free, and you can sign up at mytyo.org. Our webinar series is just one of the many ways that TYO connects you to experts and valuable learning opportunities. It is my pleasure to welcome today Ben Johnson, the team lead for the Forest Service's National Recreation Special Uses Program. We worked very closely with Ben on the Recreational Special Uses Guide for Partners that will be discussed on today's webinar, and we are extremely grateful for him joining us today. Ben, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Severia, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be able to hop on and walk through and introduce this guide to everyone. And before we jump into it, I just want to say thanks to TYO, our partner in developing this guide and putting on the webinar. And we'll go through some of these resources. So as Severia noted, my name is Ben Johnson, and I'm the team lead for the National Recreation Special Uses Program out of our Washington, D.C. headquarters. Prior to this role, I've worked on a couple of national forests around the West, and then also in a past life worked as a professional climbing and canyoneering guide for a couple of different companies around the country. So hopefully can bring a little bit of both perspectives as we walk through the process today. Also, as you'll see on the screen, there's my contact info. I'll have this up again once we get into the Q&A portion, just so you can always reach out to me if questions were unanswered or if things pop into your head after the webinar's over and want to pose a question, and then if I don't have the answer, I can connect you to a local resource that may. So the guide itself, before we get into the nuts and bolts, we've worked with TYO, as I said, to develop this guide in partnership with them. The real impetus for developing the guide came out of a pretty big sort of inquiry that the Forest Service has done over the past 5 or 6 years, particularly looking at outdoor recreation, the role the agency plays in promoting and providing outdoor recreation, and how special uses or permits play into that. Through that inquiry, we learned some pretty hard truths. We learned that, when in doubt, when it comes to permitting, if we are unsure about something, we usually say no. We also learned pretty quickly that a lot of our systems are out of date. They're not typically user-friendly, and that also our workforce is limited both in capacity and in the training that we provide to them. And so about 2 years ago, starting in 2016, we undertook an effort to modernize the Special Uses Program. And that's what we've been working on pretty diligently since that time. With some of our partners in the Coalition for Outdoor Access, we've hosted a handful of workshops around the country around permitting. We've also started to invest in an electronic application site, as well as in more training for our workforce, in the hopes that this will increase outdoor experiences that you provide your clients or customers or participants, and then also provide a better customer experience for you as well as our own workforce. This guide in particular stems from that effort. We tried to really think about how we wanted to approach developing this guide, and so reached out to quite a few non-Forest Service members to help us build it. And so what's going to happen today is we're going to walk through that guide. There's a lot of information in it, so we're going to skip some slides, skip through them rather quickly, then others will spend more time, and we can always go back in the question and answer. For those that are on the Forest Service on the call, you may see that this guide is about 20 to 25 pages long, and it really is a distillation of quite a bit of policy that we've tried to put into a guide in a manner that makes it a little bit more user-friendly. Because it is a distillation, it does not cover every circumstance or every factor that goes into the permitting process, but we hope that it gives a good general idea for the user on how the process works. The guide itself is located on a website called usffoutside.com. The left image is the homepage. If you click the Resources tab, you will find a link to this PDF guide as well as a number of other resources on this website. And then additionally, there are quite a few resources on the TYO platform itself, both for internal Forest Service folks as well as external to the Forest Service, if you want to go ahead and join that if you aren't already a member. So now to the guide. So again, the content of the rest of the presentation and the guide itself is laid out here in this agenda. We're going to spend a little bit of time giving some background, some familiarity with key terms, and then we'll go into the actual permitting process. So here's the background. So for those that don't know, the Forest Service is a pretty big agency. You know, there are about 120 or 130 national forests and units. The Forest Service itself is divided up in 9 regions. So you can look at this map and get a general idea of what region you may be operating or desiring to operate in. The permitting process itself, you know, we are limited in what we can do by the authorities that have been granted to us by Congress. And for outfitter and guide permits, which is what this learning guide is really focused on, the 2 pieces of legislation that for the most part dictate what we can and cannot do are the Federal Lands and Recreation Enhancement Act and the Term Permit Act. So if there are any policy wonks or aspiring policy wonks on the phone, that's something you can write down to get a lot more background. Additionally, in the guide, we want to provide some of the commonly used terms and their definitions in the permitting process. We realize that it's federal employees. We have quite a few pieces of terminology and definitions that are kind of hard to understand, and so this slide helps with that. We're going to go through a number of them a little bit later, but one I do want to key in on is in the top right. It's the land management plan. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's also known as the forest plan, but it is another very important document in the permitting process because it's sort of like the strategic plan for a forest and outlines what sorts of activities, whether they're permitted or not, can happen in different parts of the national forest. So that's a good thing that as you're beginning this process of looking for a permit, to find a land management plan for your forest so you can have a better idea of kind of what is allowed. So now to the what. Now quickly, there are over 74,000 special use permits around the country for all different types of use codes from uses from power lines to hydropower, et cetera, to trail runs to really large weddings. And the majority of the outdoor recreation permits would fall under the outfitting and guiding category. And so that's what we're focused on with this guide, and that's sort of how it's framed up. Although a lot of the lessons in this guide can be applied to other permit types. So outfitting and guiding in the Forest Service, it's a pretty broad term, but as you can say, it's kind of basically providing a fee for service, and that can include renting or delivering equipment to national forests. I'm guessing quite a few of you have a good idea of what outfitting and guiding means, and you can kind of see the activities that you're hoping to take fall into these categories. An important aspect of the permitting process is the differentiation between commercial and non-commercial use. That's sort of the immediate decision point when looking at permitting. When it comes to non-commercial use, if you fall under that definition, you do not need a permit unless your group is 75 people or more. So that means typically that's like big social events, like a wedding. If you're going to have a wedding on the national forest, you need a permit. But I'm guessing most of you will actually fall under the commercial use definition. So this is basically use or activity on national forest system lands, where an entry or participation fee is charged, or where the primary purpose is the sale of a good or service. And most typically, if you fall under the commercial use definition, you're going to need a permit. We'll talk about some of the ways that may not always be the case here in a minute. So you know the definition of commercial and non-commercial use. There's also different types of permits. And here are the 3 basic categories. You have your general permit, you have a temporary permit, and you have a term permit. For the purposes of outfitting and guiding, you're typically going to be dealing with temporary permits or permits. The permits are also sometimes called priority use permits. As it states, temporary permits are pretty short in duration. I would venture to guess that a lot of you have dealt with temporary permits or dealing with temporary permits right now. They're a little easier for a Forest Service unit to give out, whereas priority use permits or permits, they're longer in duration, typically have more user days, but the process for getting one of these permits is a little lengthier and has more steps. Now, it's also important to know who handles the permitting process from the standpoint of the Forest Service. And I think this is really crucial for someone who's especially looking for a new permit to kind of know who they should be talking to for different things. So the first thing is the authorized officer. This is also sometimes called the line officer. And an outfitting and guiding permit, that's usually going to be a district ranger or most likely a forest supervisor. And this is the person that actually has the federal authority to sign a permit and issue a permit. So they're kind of the key decision maker. On the other end of that equation is the special uses administrator. And so this is sort of like the program manager for that permitting process on a ranger district or a supervisor's office or national forest. Realistically, they're going to probably be your primary point of contact. They're going to be the one that you're emailing and they're emailing you back, sending you information, asking for information, and kind of walking you through the process. And then once you have a permit, they're also the folks that are going to be tracking the permit just to make sure that you're complying with the terms and conditions over time. There's also different roles for you as the permit seeker. And these roles correspond to where you are in the process. So a proponent is someone who has submitted a proposal for an application, and that's an important point of distinction. When you first put in your paperwork, it's a proposal. An applicant is someone whose proposal has been turned into an application after an initial review. And then a holder is when you actually have the permit itself and are operating on the national forest and complying with those terms and conditions. So now we'll get into the process. This is just kind of an overview slide that lines out the three major steps and some of the sub-steps that we'll go through. But I think it's important to, before we get into the particulars, to think about these three major steps in terms of the outcomes that can come from them. So a proposal, that's when you put in your initial package of information to the Forest Service. That proposal would be subject to 2 initial levels of screening that kind of go through a series of questions that you need to get the correct answer to move forward. If you get the correct answer to, then your proposal can be moved to an application. That means it's been formally accepted by the Forest Service for processing. A couple of key things when your application or when your proposal turns into an application. One, you may be subject to cost recovery. It depends on the amount of analysis that needs to be done to approve or deny the application. Additionally, that analysis is now required. So there's going to be a certain level of environmental analysis needed depending on what the specific activity is that you're proposing. And then 2, if your application is denied, you can actually appeal that. Whereas if your proposal is denied because it did not pass that initial screening, you cannot appeal that decision. So that's a pretty big distinction. Once your proposal goes into application state, you have sort of more tools at your disposal and as you go through the process. And then the final step would be the authorization itself. So that's the permit that lines out the activity, grants permission for the use of national forest lands, and has the terms and conditions that you have to abide by. So let's get into a little bit of the process details. So the first step is the pre-meeting, and this is not a required step in terms of Forest Service policy, but it is something that in working with our partners and internally with Forest Service staff is something that we highly recommend. Our recommendation here is to reach out to that Forest Service office, and some of you may be already doing this, but reach out to them prior to actually submitting your paperwork so that you can kind of talk through the activities you're proposing. You can get feedback from the Forest Service employee about, you know, just for example, if you're proposing to go somewhere and that's what you're going to put in your proposal in a certain valley. Well, the employee might be able to tell you, well, actually, there's a lot of permits there already, or there's certain resource concerns there already. And if you actually reframed your proposal to go to this part of the national forest, it might be more successful in its application process. So we definitely recommend that you try and do that. I know that can be hard, particularly at different times of the year, to get responses back from Forest Service employees. We'll talk a little bit about timing in our tips and tricks section. But there's a very real reality out there that some of these employees' time is very limited. And so there is going to have to be a certain level of patience in trying to get a response for that pre-meeting. Additionally, in this pre-meeting, you can get a little bit more insight on what's going to be needed for a successful proposal and application package, like business plans, insurance, licenses, etc. Once you have your pre-meeting, then you can submit your proposal. This, in a future state, will hopefully be done online, so it's very low barrier to entry, and you can, don't have to go to the Forest Service office to do it in person. But you can submit it in person, or you can submit it by mail. But the key there is to really make sure that it's a complete proposal and to reach back out to that Forest Service permit administrator after you submit it to make sure they have everything that they need. Once the Forest Service employee receives their proposal, that's when we go into 2 levels of screening. The first one, and this is all kind of spelled out in our policy, is initial screening. And so you basically need to go through these 9 questions, and the permit administrator will take your proposed activity, compare them to these questions or statements, and then if you pass all 9, you move to the second level of screening. Some of these pieces of screening are kind of funny, and some make sense. So if you can look at number 2, the proposed use is consistent or can be made consistent with the forest plan. That's referring to that land management plan that was on the definitions page. So making sure that you look at that plan before you submit your proposal and make sure what you're proposing aligns with it is crucial, so that you do not get dinged on this particular step. Additionally, the proposed use, number 5, the proposed use will not unreasonably conflict or interfere with use by the Forest Service or other permit holders, which is what it means by authorized existing uses. So that's another thing to think of when you're putting your proposal together about where you want to go for your trip, is trying to get a sense of where other folks are operating under permit, and then maybe you want to go somewhere where there's not as many permit holders operating in order to be a little bit more successful. There are also some weird things in initial screening, like the proposed use does not involve gambling or military or paramilitary training. So then you'll get to second level screening. This is the same process, it's just a different set of questions. These ones are a little bit more refined, and it is really starting to look at what the specific activity is, and then also specifically how you've demonstrated your ability to carry out the proposed activity, both financially or technically. And so this is where it's really important in your proposal to have a really good operating plan, even submit your business plan, copies of your certifications, licenses, things of that nature, so that it's very transparent and straightforward that you meet these criteria. This also could be your proof of liability insurance. So once you go through second level screening, there's another step that's sort of a recently revived step. And to be honest, this step, which is called the nominal effect assessment or determination, it can happen before the initial and second level screening. It's not, the policy does not dictate where it needs to occur. But what a nominal effect assessment means, or determination means, is that if your proposed use is deemed to have such nominal or minimal effects on the environment in the national forest, the authorized officer can determine that you do not need a permit. This is completely up to the discretion of the authorized officer, so that's that district ranger or forest supervisor. But they can determine that you do not need a permit because the effects of the activity are so nominal. There are pros and cons to this approach. One, it can be really a quick option to sort of go forward with your programming, but it does sort of lie at the complete discretion of that district ranger or forest supervisor. A lot of outfitters and guides I've spoken to actually would prefer to have a real permit, just because it sort of gives a certain amount of credibility for your operation, particularly if you're having to take out loans, things like that for equipment. But this is an option, and it's one we can talk in more detail on in the Q&A perhaps. There's also more information on this on the USFS Outside website. So assuming you're moving forward and you've passed your initial and second level screening, your proposal would then be turned into an application. And so when your proposal is turned into an application, this is when the environmental assessment kicks in. And the environmental assessment process for federal agencies is dictated by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Some of you may be familiar with this. And there are 3 levels of analysis within this framework that could be applied towards your application. I would venture to guess that most of you would fall under a categorical exclusion or possibly an environmental assessment for your proposed activity. As you might guess, categorical exclusions are the least complex. Environmental impact statements are the most complex, and the amount of time they take to do one of them sort of parallels that level of complexity. I know that there was one question before the webinar started that was sent in talking about some of the recent efforts with the Forest Service to kind of streamline or take a look at the way we're applying the National Environmental Policy Act. And the Special Uses Program has been involved with that. We've been providing comment to the folks running that effort on some of the efficiencies that could be gained with some changes specifically for the Special Uses Program and specifically for recreation uses like outfitting and guiding and recreation events like trail runs, et cetera, so that this process can be thorough and we can adhere to the National Environmental Policy Act, but also so that we can kind of provide a better atmosphere for getting some of these low impact uses approved. Additionally, when you're in an application stage, I mentioned that you might be charged cost recovery. So depending on how complex your permit, your proposed activity is, sort of like if it's over 50 hours of use or analysis time, there's a chance that we will need to charge cost recovery or basically have you pay for that analysis. I would guess the majority of you do not meet that 50-hour cap. So that's really for like more complex uses. The thing that pops into my head is something like a heli ski operation where the level of analysis is just higher because the proposed activity is more involved. Once you go through NEPA assessment, that's where a decision can be made on whether or not your application is approved and you get a permit. So assuming that you pass the application stage, you would then get your permit. It's a relatively straightforward operation where we'll fill out the permit. We'll go through the terms and conditions with you as the soon-to-be permit holder. The terms and conditions, some of them are just solely related to liability, but there also might be terms and conditions based on where you're hoping to operate. So we might put in some terms that you can only go to certain areas at certain times of the years because of threatened and endangered species, things of that nature. Then once you get your permit, that's when the administration of the permit starts. So you will then begin, you'll then be able to operate. And then there will be sort of a new phase of the relationship with the Forest Service in that we will be checking in with you. We'll be requiring certain information related to your user days, how your trips are going, et cetera, so that we can administer that permit and make sure that it's the relationship's going well, that you're getting what you need out of it, and that we're getting what we need out of it as the land management agency. And now, in our last few minutes here before Q&A, we do want to go over some tips and tricks that we've picked up from partners and internally over the years that hopefully will help with the permitting process. So one, in your proposal, we really invite you to be concise, but at the same time thorough, which may be a little cognitive dissonance in your head. But be sure to use full names. If it's a company that's applying for the permit, be sure to use the full legal name. All that stuff must match on all the pages. Additionally, if you're applying for a permit, you must be 21 years old. That's in our policy that if you're under 21, you cannot be a permit holder. With the project description, definitely be detailed. That'll help the permit administrator when it's in an application phase to really think through what is the truly appropriate level of environmental analysis that needs to be done in order to move your permit forward. So be detailed. The best way to do that, and this is a little bit below, but is provide really good maps. Can't stress that enough. Detailed maps with routes, etc., that are done nicely and very user-friendly can really speed the process up. And then additionally, that fourth bullet is the environmental protection plan. We're going to ask you for this, so I would just recommend that you go ahead and start thinking about what an environmental protection plan for your proposed use might look like and getting that on paper. A great resource would be the Center for Outdoor Ethics, the Leave No Trace folks, in terms of things that you can build in, particularly for lower level uses like climbing, hiking, backpacking, paddling, some of those business practices that you can build into your environmental protection plan to kind of keep that moving forward. And then the final one, and hopefully you're already thinking about this as an operator, as a commercial entity or a nonprofit, is insurance. We're going to definitely ask you for proof of insurance. You're required to have insurance, and you're also required to name the United States government as an additionally insured. So if that's a process that is new to you of adding additionally insured folks to your insurance, I would go ahead and start asking your insurance provider about that, just so you can get ahead of it, because it will be asked for. Additionally, any insights or documentation you can provide around the technical and financial capability of you and your organization. For a lot of you, this is going to be certifications. So we don't necessarily across the board require certain certifications for certain activities, but it is very helpful if you can offer up that information, whether it's your WWOOFer, WMT, or AMGA, or whatever certification is very useful. Another tip, I'm gonna skip the fees. We can go to that if a lot of you are have questions about it. But I'm going to go to the timeline, because I think that's something that's very important. When you're thinking about putting your proposal in, I really want to stress to think about the timeline. So just for some insights from inside the Forest Service. For the most part, most national forests have their entire year of work outlined and approved starting in October of each year. So the federal fiscal year starts in October 1 of each year. And so for the most part, most of their time is planned out for that whole year. So I would offer up that it's a good time to submit proposals for the next year's use would be kind of in this summer to very early fall at the latest. And the more time you can get ahead of that, the better. The caveat I'll give to that is some forests are actually offering up open seasons, is what they call it. And so they'll actually say on their website or through email blasts when they're accepting new permit proposals for certain times of the year. This is becoming more and more common. I really like it because it's a way of kind of controlling the workload internally, and also putting out some really great expectations for you as permit seekers in terms of when to apply for certain times of the year. So I would offer that up, is just to think of that. Additionally, the way the Forest Service works is a lot of our folks out in the field are extremely busy, just like y'all are in the field season or the summer season. And that's compounded even more when you factor in a lot of our employees going on fire assignments and the fire season being longer and longer. So really want to stress that the more you can get ahead of the timeline and getting your proposals in, the better. That's also a great thing to talk to the permit administrator or the Forest Service employee when you have that pre-meeting, just to kind of get an idea of when it would be the best time to interact with them. And then finally, who to contact. I know it can be really hard to get in touch with some Forest Service offices, but I will say that each national forest should have at least a public service staff officer out of their headquarters. And so that is someone that should be able to point you in the right direction, whether it's them doing the work or someone on the ranger district. And so I would offer that up, that reach out to those folks. And then when in doubt, I know it takes some time, but showing up in person to a ranger station or the supervisor's office, you may only talk to the front desk, but they should be able to put you in touch with the appropriate person. And with that, that should give us a little less than 30 minutes for some Q&A. So I will hand it back over to Severia, and thank you for listening to me go through those slides and the guide for half an hour.
Thanks, Ben. And before we get going into questions, we wanted to land on this slide just so that you guys have access to the usfsoutside.com, where all the resource that Ben was just talking about is available, as well as his contact info. So you can take note of those. I'm actually going to go back, Ben, to the screening part of the process. There's a couple questions when you were talking about that. So there's one, is there a plan in place to standardize proposal documents between service areas as they truly vary in size, shape, and how well the document works?
We do not have it's a great idea and good question. We don't have a national plan to standardize. Most folks or most units will tell you to use a form that's called the SF-299 form as the basis for your proposal. And that form is plenty confusing to folks because it doesn't even talk about outfitting and guiding on it. But that is the form. And then that's really another beauty of the pre-meeting, if you can get it, is to kind of really walk through what that expectation is of that local unit. But I'm taking note on the idea of standardizing it nationally.
Great, thanks. Also, in that general time frame, there was a question, if the institution that is seeking a permit asks for an addendum to the terms, what is the typical outcome? Is it worth the time to ask for an addendum to the terms, or is it a waste of time?
I think it's a good thing to ask because we want to make sure that the permit relationship is going well. And I guess it would depend obviously on what the addendum is in terms of what the outcome would be. But I would definitely recommend to ask just so that everyone's getting what they need to on both sides.
Great. Let's see, more into the NEPA part of the conversation. Is there a list of categorical exclusions?
There is a list. It is in part of it is in our handbook, and then some of them are also in the Code of Federal Regulations. And I don't have the citations right off the top of my head, but I can get them and provide them to TYO for maybe our email blast after the webinar.
Great. Question, how would an organization's, and this is again sort of in that NEPA section, how would an organization's demonstrated use of Leave No Trace education programs factor into being approved for the NEPA process?
Yeah, so it gets to the environmental protection plan. So there, in all likelihood, will be some level of requirement in the terms and conditions to preempt or rehabilitate the area that your permit is for. And for something like hiking, that can be just as simple as committing yourself to practicing Leave No Trace principles. for the NEPA or the decision on what level of NEPA analysis to put forward, the more you can front load in the proposal of steps you will take to potentially mitigate any environmental impacts is what we're thinking of there. And so that's the beauty of including stuff like L&T into your proposal package, because the person going through the form will say, oh, well, I'm concerned about, where they're going to be camping on these trips. And then in the proposal, you say, well, we're actually going to, camp and travel only on durable surfaces. And so that they can kind of like check the box on that concern. And then so hopefully it wouldn't have to go to another level of analysis, if that makes sense.
It does. Let's see, there's another thing relative to NEPA. I'm just reading really quick, sorry. So Ben, there's a question in the chat to the panelists from Jason. So when discussing potential CUA with the Forest Service land manager, they said there's not a lot of money and resources to complete the NEPA requirement. And they do not have, and they simply do not have, looks like the resources to do a CUA or a SUA for their forest. What is the next best step? Again, also sort of related to that.
Yeah, that's a common thing that we hear. And what we've been trying to do, at least from the national level, is I mentioned those workshops that we were talking about with the Coalition for Outdoor Access. So those workshops were spurred on by a letter that was sent from the Chief of the Forest Service in 2016. And one of the components of that letter is talking about environmental analysis and really trying to remind permit administrators, Forest Service staff, to really think critically about the level of analysis that they're doing for these proposed activities, and really emphasized using these categorical exclusions for outdoor recreation, for most outdoor recreation activities. The sentiment from the Chief's office is that we aren't using these CEs, is what we call them, enough. And so that guidance went to the field and has kind of been picked up by certain units and not picked up by others. And that's just part of the process of changing kind of the mentality of a very large organization. But that guidance and that letter is actually on the USFS Outside website. So it might be a good thing to familiarize yourself with as you keep having those conversations.
Great. Just on that note, as far as resources, a lot of people have asked if this PowerPoint will be available and the resource links after. So all of this information is available on the usfsoutside.com website, which is on the screen right now. We also have it available on the mytyo.org website. So you can definitely go there and pull that information. We absolutely want you to share all the stuff that we're sharing with you. It is public information. We also will be sending out a link to the PowerPoint and this video or this webinar recording after the meeting to everyone who was able to attend and could not attend, just as a little note as we keep going. Okay, the questions are flying in, Ben. Can you provide any more information how we might be able to submit a proposal claiming that we have nominal effect?
Yeah, so the nominal effect is an interesting one. So thanks for bringing that up. My recommendation would be to have a conversation with the line officer or the authorized official, that district ranger. And I would go into the conversation not trying to justify how you have nominal effects or your opinion on the matter, because it really comes down to the risk, how comfortable the line officer is with risk and how well they understand the activity that you're trying to take. And to be honest, some line officers, some district rangers and forest supervisors are not comfortable with nominal effects determinations and would prefer to go the permit route. And that's completely up to their discretion. But I would just offer up, really just try and start it with a conversation, really trying to explain what your activity is, explain the ways that you already mitigate any of the potential impacts, things of that nature, and then hopefully that can be the start of going down that path.
Great. So I have a couple questions regarding sort of defining who needs a permit. So one is a permit required no matter how big or small the size of your group is and where you're going, as long as you are charging for the program and does this include the backcountry?
Correct. If you are a commercial activity, which basically in the Forest Service definitions mean whether or not you're charging a fee, it's not tied to whether or not you're a nonprofit or a for-profit company. But if you're a commercial activity or use, you do need a permit no matter where you're going.
Thank you. And so on sort of this note, just for additional clarification, we have a question that says, I run a nonprofit that takes kids backpacking onto Forest Service land. Technically, it's not a commercial endeavor the way you're defining it, as we don't charge participants to come on the trips, but we do fund the outings from donations and grants. Do we need permits?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a gray area. And again, that one comes down to there is a little bit of discretion for the district ranger or forest supervisor, depending on the specifics of the scenario, to say that a special use authorization or a permit is not required for that sort of situation. But it's not across the board, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. Sorry, there are lots of questions. I'm trying to group them so they're relevant. Have there been many successful examples of nominal effects waivers being used for short-term outfitter guiding? Do we have any case studies on that? Do you know, Ben?
Yeah, there are some. It's kind of funny. So nominal effects is sort of it was like a policy rediscovery, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago when we started with the Chief's letter in 2016. And the more we talk to, particularly like district rangers who've been district rangers for a long time, the more their immediate feedback would be like, yeah, I've been doing this for the past 20 years. So it's not a new authority, and I think it happens more often than you know. And to be honest, you may have had a nominal effects determination and it just wasn't phrased that way. But you sort of got permission by an email or a phone call from a district ranger to go and do an activity. What really happened there was you got a nominal effects determination. I do see it happen quite a bit for after school programs, like things of that nature, where we're just trying to take classrooms out to picnic areas, et cetera, where they technically would need a permit, but the line officer is comfortable with what's going on and the minimal amount of impact and no need to put terms and conditions on the use and give them a nominal effects determination. The only thing I'll add there, Severia, is some units are actually taking nominal effects quite seriously and have put together sort of decision-making tools that help them decide whether or not a use would be a nominal effect or not, and then make a recommendation to their line officer. That's not across the board, but I've seen a little bit of that in Region 1 of the Forest Service, which is basically Montana and a little bit of Idaho, as well as in Region 5, which is California.
Fantastic. Let's do some, here we go. Can you please explain USFS efforts to administer permits for potential recreation uses that cross multiple jurisdictions? Are there any tips and tricks or current efforts we should be aware of? So crossing over into National Park Service, state, BLM, sort of multi-land use.
Yeah, so I'll take that in 2 ways. So one thing that we've been doing is trying to do a better job of coordinating and issuing permits even when it's a use that crosses different national forests. So Region 2 has been, which is Colorado and a little bit of Wyoming, has been taking the lead on this, I would say, around the country, where they're actually, for some of their permits, are delegating 5 forests worth of permits. They're making one forest supervisor the decision maker. And so basically you can get a permit that is good for, the 4 or 5 surrounding national forests around you. They've been really successful in that, especially with things like trail runs and bike races, things of that nature. In terms of permits for uses that cross other federal land management agencies and state land management agencies, that is a work in progress, but it's an extremely popular topic right now. So we've been in a lot of conversations with the BLM on what that would look like to start issuing permits for Forest Service and BLM use concurrently. And so that's kind of in progress, but signs seem to be pointing towards that being something we continue to explore and try and figure out.
Thanks. Thank you, Ben. Are there any plans in place to switch to a recreation.gov type of online process where the application is online, fees are online, and has space to upload specific required documents?
Yeah, so we are right in the middle of getting a platform like that up and running. We used to refer to it as e-permitting quite a bit. I think it has a new name called Open Forest. We're in the process of developing the website right now, and then hope to be piloting it come this spring, summer. The initial pilot will be on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in Washington. And the initial use types that the permit system will handle will be temporary outfitter and guide and non-commercial group use, which is those big gatherings of more than 75 people. And so we'll pilot it there, and then assuming everything goes well, we'll expand it to other forests. It will be that sort of platform where you can go in, create an account, basically upload all of the pertinent information, and then send it to the permit administrator. And then on the receiving end, it'll interact with our internal project management databases so that the permit administrator for that area gets a notification that a new proposal came in, et cetera. So we're really excited about that. I believe that some of the other land management agencies are also working on a similar thing. And so we're trying to do some coordination right now so that, all 6 federal land management agencies aren't recreating the wheel at the same time.
Great, thank you. So I think going back to sort of defining commercial versus non-commercial use, we have a few questions related to that. One question is on the commercial, non-commercial use slide, what is the non-commercial use considerations at the bottom? Page 9 of our presentation.
Yeah, so this kind of gets to the past question about when I said there was some discretion with the authorized officer on determining a use may not be required. So the policy is not super clear on some of these categories that are listed here, but things like cost sharing, there's potential that the line officer might say you do not need a permit. Additionally, fundraisers, particularly if the actual fundraising is happening off-site, so not on the national forest, there's potential there as well. But this is a little bit gray, and we realize it's gray, and as we update policy in the next year or so, which is our plan, we're hoping to better delineate what it means, because it definitely causes confusion internally and externally.
Great. Are there any special considerations for colleges or universities pursuing special use permits?
Yes, I know that this is, we worked a lot with the Association for Outdoor Recreation and Education, which has quite a few university members, and there does seem to be a sort of a misperception that universities do not need permits. For the most part, they do need a permit because they are charging an entry or participation fee, particularly for things like extracurricular outdoor clubs or university-sponsored trips, things of that nature.
Great, Ben. And on that note, so if they want to do a training, or if a group wants to do a staff training where no one's being paid except for the trainees, or the trainers, sorry, are being paid, would that require a permit as well?
Yeah, it most likely does.
Great. All right, moving along. Is there an amount and nature of issued permits in a given area available to the public? Can we as outfitters see whether or not a specific area is heavily used by other organizations to help allow us to know, to help them in their process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's going to be unit by unit, so national forest by national forest in terms of kind of like, I'll just say the number of permits that they have to give out. Some forests are more complicated in their approach there, where they've actually done environmental assessments and analysis to come up with a total number of user days for certain areas or for the forest as a whole. And so those forests are very, very dictated or very controlled by that number because there's an official decision in environmental analysis that backs it up. Other forests have not done that level of analysis and have found that there's not a need to. Maybe there's just not a lot of use on that forest, or there aren't as many resource concerns, and so they may not have those hard quotas. In terms of finding out areas where there are a lot of permittees operating, there is no systematic way to do that. The best thing I could offer up is to try and contact a local office to get an idea of where there are already folks operating, or to try and reach out to your local outfitter and guide community. I know that some people could be kind of protective about that, but that's probably the best way to try and get a sense.
Great. Is there so I know we've been talking a lot about nominal use activities, and I know that there's, as you said, there's a lot of discretion among the different agencies or the different land managers, but is there a plan to standardize nominal use activities? Is there like a checklist or a quick way for people to see if they might qualify?
Yeah, so in the 2016 letter from the chief, there's a little bit of guidance around that. And for the time being, that's kind of the plan of we're not planning to put out additional standardization or guidance around exactly how to do nominal effects determinations, in part because we want to be able to let local forests use that tool as best as they see fit.
Great. Here's what about temporary permits. If applying for a temporary permit, is it necessary to apply before the new fiscal year?
Yeah, so applying before the new fiscal year isn't a requirement, it's just a suggestion. And like I said, some forests will actually dictate other times of the year when they accept permits, and have open seasons or a couple open seasons per year. So you can put your permit proposal in any time. We just wanted to state with the October 1 deadline that in order to, if you're wanting to get on sort of the program of work, so to speak, for the next fiscal year, just realize that come October 1, most folks already have their work planned out for the year. And so it'll be harder for them to take in sort of walk-in business after that point. Not impossible, but it'll be harder.
Got it, thank you. So just, we're 5 minutes to the scheduled end of the webinar, but we wanted to let you know, because there are so many questions, we are gonna try to stay on about 5 or 10 minutes longer to keep answering questions. So hopefully if you have the time, you will be able to stay with us, and we're gonna continue to keep busting through these questions. So here's a question. Are there any templates online or examples of successful applications?
They're not, in part because typically folks don't want to share that because it can have proprietary info about their business. But that's a good idea that I'm writing down as something maybe we can work with TYO or the Coalition for Outdoor Access on.
Fantastic. Are there any plans of creating some sort of equity in who gets permits and how many? The question is, an example, somebody's user days are capped at 45 in a special use area where somebody has 200. Is there any sort of plan to make it more equitable?
Yeah, and so the thing I would say to that, and I know that's a common concern, is why do some people get more permits than others and more user days? For the user day question, there is a tool already that Forest can use that if, for example, a 200 user day permit holder is not using all of their days, after a certain amount of time of not using them, a percentage of those, I'll just say extra days, can be reallocated to other permit holders and permit seekers. One of the issues that we run into with that is that it does take a little bit more knowledge and technical skill set to orchestrate that sort of transfer. And a lot of our local staff, maybe because they're new administrators or we haven't provided them with the correct training, don't know how to do it. And so that's something we're trying to wrap our heads around, of how we can get better training to those folks so that it occurs more often in areas.
Thanks, Ben. Here's an interesting question. As a permitted outfitter, how does the process work for having employees, partners, or independent contractors using the permit user days? Can the outfitter use independent contracts to fill the permitted user days by taking a fee from the independent contractor? How does the independent contractor, or does the independent contractor need to be a permittee as well?
There is some latitude to do that sort of setup, to have folks work underneath your permit. I would definitely, if you're already a permit holder, I would talk to your administrator about that. And then if you do have, it's a pretty specific one, so also feel free to reach out to me as well at that email address there, and maybe I can help you out.
Can you apply for nominal use for additional days if you have an existing permit? And I'm assuming that question is referring to, just adding on to one permit that they already have.
Yeah, so I would rephrase that in that if you get a nominal effects determination, you are no longer in the permit game. So it wouldn't be an addition or added to your permit. There are pros and cons to not being in the permit game, right? It makes life a lot easier, and you can go out and do your thing. At the same time, you do not have that relationship with the forest, as well as the longevity that a permit can give you, particularly like a priority use permit. Again, some of the feedback I've got is it's easier to build a business around a permit than it is about a nominal effects determination. So I'll just throw that out there, but there is nothing to stop you from trying to have a conversation with your local district ranger about additional days that might qualify for a nominal effects determination, but it would not be part of your permit.
Thanks for that clarification. That was super helpful. So let's see, $1 million question. How long does the process normally take from proposal to getting a permit? And is there any sort of average?
But there's not an average that I know of, and it would probably be kind of sad if I did. It's going to be totally dependent on the local staff, both their training and their capacity. I've talked with some forests that you can get, especially like a temporary use permit, very quickly, very, very quick process. And others, they won't even consider it because of their resource concerns. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer there.
But that was a great lead into these other temporary permit questions. So let's go over those really quick. If you get a temporary permit, do you have to reapply each year? You
do. Temporary permits cannot be renewed. It may seem like it because maybe you have a track record of getting one every year, but those are technically distinct permits.
Got it. And so do you know if those generally, if the people who have those get a preference on it for the next year on, for reapplying and getting it? Or is that, again, probably specific to the—
Yeah, there's not necessarily policy saying that you get a preference, but you do have an established relationship even after just 1 year of a temporary permit, which can go quite a long ways at times.
Great. Here's a question about people applying for new permits versus current permit holders. Are current permit holders given preference, and are they just considered grandfathered in, or do they also have to reapply? And is there a preference between newer businesses versus current permit holders?
Yeah, so the biggest distinction there will be between temporary permits and then what are called priority use permits. I believe there's some folks on the call that probably have priority use permits. Those are longer, typically about 10 years, and they essentially renew automatically. I mean, you still have to apply or send in info, but they have much longer longevity, even more than one permit term length. And so they're kind of in a different category. Priority use permits, also the application process can be different, where a Forest Service will actually call for proposals and it'll be a competitive process.
Thanks. Okay. And then do you have any recommendations for people who've held temporary permits for multiple years on transitioning those over to actual permit or a priority use permit?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the biggest holdups there, or something you'll probably run into, depending on where you're at, is whether or not there is an environmental decision that authorizes that extended amount of use. So a lot of times priority use permits will be dictated by something like an environmental assessment versus a categorical exclusion. So that would be a good, at least initial step to try and figure out if there's already a decision on the books related to those longer and more expensive permits.
Got it. Ben, do you have any recommendations for districts where there's guides or companies that have days that are not utilizing them, and so therefore other people aren't getting them? Is there any sort of process or conversation that can happen to help reassess that for the organizations who do want to use them, even though the days aren't being used, even though they're allocated? Yeah,
so that I mentioned it briefly, but that gets to the user day pool that can be created. So again, it takes some work, and so it's going to be very dependent on what sort of resources, both either externally or internally, can be brought to the table. But that's the tool, is if there are unused days, is to start a conversation with your administrator about setting up, basically reallocating those days to the use of a pool. But, it, as I said, can take work, and not all districts are going to have the capacity, at least internally, to them to do that.
Great, thanks, Ben. Also, just for those of you who are still on the call, there is a forum that Ben will be hosting, and so we will also be trying to put some of these Q&A and some of the questions and themes that have come up. We will try to address those on the special use forum. Ben, can you talk to, do we have any, I believe that's going to be on the USFS Outside site. It's not up yet, I believe, but yeah. We are in the works of developing a forum so that this conversation can be continued.
Yeah, so kind of a next phase in our partnership with Transforming Youth Outdoors, as well as the Coalition for Outdoor Access, is to develop a forum online where what we're hoping to do, and I think, Severia, you're right, using a lot of the questions we don't get to today as the basis for that forum, but we're hoping to try and look at all the questions we've received and distill them down to like 10 different themes or thematic questions and provide answers. And then are also hoping to allow for the submission of other questions that on about possibly a monthly basis, someone from the Forest Service will hop in and answer those questions. So we're still in the early days yet of trying to set that up, but that is kind of phase 2 of this effort.
There's actually a great recommendation. Ryan, I don't have an answer to this, but there's a request question. Any chance we could have a similar webinar like this, but on a smaller scale, maybe per region or on an annual basis, to clarify, to speak more to somebody's specific area? It's a great idea.
Yeah, that is a great idea. I like that, and it's a good insight as well, because you'll probably notice, for the most part, I've been talking in generalities, and that's simply because there are so many specific issues that can come into play in the permitting process that are locally based, that I don't want to misinform you. But a smaller venue like that could help us get a little deeper. So we'll have to ponder that one, Severia.
Cool. And this also may be a little bit specific, but an interesting question. If you were trying to get a priority use permit on Forest Service property adjacent to a property that you can make a historical use argument on the Forest Service property if the previous property owner was using but wasn't permitted, can you? Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure.
Yeah, we might have to offline that one.
Yeah. All right, Andrew.
Andrew. Yeah, Andrew, if you want to send me an email. Yeah.
It's pretty specific. And that's actually a good point, you guys, is that a lot of these questions, Ben may not be able to answer them directly again because they may be specific to your area, but please note if we don't get to them today, please note that his email is there to address these questions. Here's one for you, Ben. What is the advantage or disadvantage of a temporary or a 5-year permit?
That's a good question. I never thought of an disadvantage on that one. I mean, the advantage of the temporary permit is, for the most part, it's a much quicker process. But at the same time, with a temporary permit, you're going to be capped by policy on the number of user days. Whereas with the longer term permits, obviously it takes more time. You may have to provide more information, but potentially you can have much more use. 200 user days can go pretty darn fast when you're guiding an area. And so that's probably the biggest disadvantage.
Great. Do you have any tips on how someone can proactively deal with a district that is taking 2+ years to renew a CE priority permit, or is not able to communicate with permit holders because admin positions have been empty? Yeah,
I mean, especially if your relationship is with the district, if possible, and again, I know the response rate for some Forest Service folks with email and stuff, but getting a chance to sit down when it ultimately comes to it with that line officer, so that might be the district ranger or might be the forest supervisor, to try and have a conversation of how y'all can work together to get to success a little quicker. Another thing that I've seen pretty successful in certain spots around the country is if externally to the Forest Service, all the permit holders and different outfitter and guide types are able to come together and sort of organize that meeting with the forest, so that it's the forest has the ability to talk to their full audience at the same time, is usually helpful. And some forests actually host events with their permit holders on a bi-yearly or yearly basis.
Thanks, Ben.
And I say all that really just from my point of view and in my experience outside the Forest Service and inside it, it's really it takes a lot of work, but establishing and maintaining that relationship with the forest, and particularly with the line officers, is crucial. I kind of think of line officers as being sort of the business owners or the CEOs of their little forest. And when it comes down to it, y'all are likely the executive director or the CEO of your business or nonprofit. And so having that peer-to-peer relationship can be key.
Thanks. So I know that we did not get to everybody's questions, and we apologize that. We are going to try to go through and make an archive of all of these. Again, I really encourage everyone to go to UF outside. There's a ton of great resources there, and a lot of your answers may be questioned in the resources that we've collected for you, as well as Ben's information. I know if he doesn't know the answer, he can probably forward it on to somebody who might know the answer. We really want to thank you for your time today and joining us on this call. We know that this is a really important topic that a lot of people are interested in, so we will definitely also consider, as we move forward, looking to ways maybe to make them more regional or more relevant to your area, because we know that there's a lot of people that have a lot of specific questions. Ben, is there anything you would like to wrap it up with?
No, I mean, I'll just say thanks to Severia and TYO, and thanks to all of you for hopping on. You know, it's a complicated program area, and I really appreciate y'all's patience. Some of you years of patience going through the process. And so I truly believe we're on a good trajectory to change this program for the better, so it really works for everyone involved. So thanks for your participation.
Great. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.